In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song.
You are welcome to the 16th episode of the Attic Sessions, and today we are in the company of the poet and critic Gerard Smyth, who's here to talk about his most recent publication, The Yellow River, which is a collaboration with the painter Sean McSweeney. Jerry, you're very welcome to the Attic.
You.
Thanks for coming
Delighted
along.
to be here.
And before we hone in specifically on The Yellow River, you've been writing for 40 years?
Well, my friend Gerard reminded me it was almost 50 years recently. I started writing in the 67, 68 and started publishing in 1969, so it's closer to the 50.
And you've published about 8 collections of
I think this counts, the Yellow River is actually the 9th. Some of the earlier books were sort of apprentice books, which I probably have taken off my CV.
And were you interested in the visual arts over that period of time, or how did you get into?
I think my interest in the visual arts developed to some degree more to do with my journalistic practice as a writer on culture and the arts. I know I started going in to Dublin art galleries probably as far back as the 1970s. I don't have any gifts in that particular discipline. Quite a number of poets do. They can write for the page and they can go and work on a canvas and draw. Elizabeth Bishop is an example, and there are many others. And I've always thought that some certain poets were very good art critics. Ashbery has written a great deal about the visual art, and I like the company of artists, which I think possibly what we have in common is the image, the image in text, and the image in a representational way on the canvas. So I was going in and out of galleries quite a lot, and the image has always appealed to me.
And were you writing about what you saw?
It was much later that I would have started writing in about either painters or their work. It was much later. It was not initially, and that the collaborative element of actually working with artists came even much later again.
You have a collaboration with it's Brian Maguire, don't you? A volume.
I've collaborated with Brian and with Donald Teskey prior to the project with Sean McSweeney, on a much smaller scale. The collaboration with Brian Maguire was I had been in the course of 2016, as many of us was invited to get involved, actually not here in Ireland but in London, in an event, and I was asked would I have a body of poems to read on the occasion, as well as to discuss the legacy of the 1916 poets. I had a number of poems which could be drawn together, and I wrote some others, and when Jamie Murphy in the Salvage Press said, "Oh, we'll do that as a book," he always likes to have some kind of image and to have the visual side. I mean, he's based in NCAD, so he likes the visual element, and given sort of Brian's own work and how it focuses on the political and the social, and I've known Brian and I admired his work greatly. I think the first time I saw his paintings was way back in the Hendricks Gallery in Stephen's Green, when he was a very young painter. I've always admired the work. I asked Brian, would he do something, or would he have something, or had he given any thought to having a work that was appropriate to the 1916 commemoration, and he came up with a wonderful image which was combined with the it's actually a painting of an Irish passport, which he felt was the most significant outcome of the events of 1916. With Donald Teskey, I'm a great admirer of Teskey's work as well. Before, he's quite well known now, I suppose, for his coastline paintings and depictions. But I remembered him as a pretty kind of gritty urban painter as well. He painted some. It was one of the best, and I think I've said this in something I either wrote or at a launch. I opened one of his exhibitions, some wonderful work set in inner Dublin years ago. But when Poetry Ireland actually did a project called Rhyme and Resin, which you may recall, which was combining poets and painters.
Oh, no, I don't know.
It was a fundraising for the organisation.
Okay.
Poets were asked to, if they knew a visual artist, would they ask them to do a collaboration? And I asked Donald, would he do it? And I sent him a poem, which was a Dublin poem called An Evening Walk in Maryland. And he did quite a wonderful big painting, which the works were sold to raise money. So subsequently later, when I did another book called We Like It Here Beside the River, which was a sequence of Dublin poems, I asked Donald, would you do a drawing for it? And he did, a drawing set in the James Street area of that wonderful St. Patrick's Tower.
Oh, yeah.
So they were at that level.
And very much within sort of, because I know people associate you with Dublin, it's where you're from. A lot of your subject matter in many of the poems has been about, you know, those streets that you have pounded. So it might be a surprise for people to know that this book, The Yellow River, is in Meath, is set in Meath. So maybe tell us how it came about.
Yes, I have probably a deep association with Dublin. I grew up in Dublin. And to some extent it's probably that association. Very few critics have ever acknowledged the fact that various books have had Meath poems. I say in the introduction to The Yellow River that when I was asked to do the project, my only hesitancy was the fact that I had actually written quite a number of Meath poems, scattered throughout several collections. And Meath is also where I wrote my first poems in the summer of 1968. I'll come back to that. But the project arose because I opened an exhibition for Sean McSweeney in the Sauces Arts Centre close on 10 years ago. It was a big retrospective exhibition of his work. I had been aware of Sean's own links to Meath through another extraordinary circumstance. Growing up in the Liberties in Dublin, Sean's brother lived next door.
Oh, wow.
Sean's brother Noel. I lived in Pimlico when I lived in Francis Street on Pimlico, and then Francis Street again. But next door to the Smyth family home in Pimlico was Noel McSweeney. I didn't know either when I was very young and then into my early adolescence that Noel had any linkage to a real artist and whose reputation and fame, in fact, had grown considerably. It was, I think, my sister who alerted me to the fact that some wonderful work kept appearing on the walls in McSweeney house next door. And she and Noel had these conversations about Noel's family and the fact that the father came from Meath. And she discovered that Noel's father came from the same part of Meath as our mother. So I knew this was something I knew when I started talking to Sean. I'd known Sean's work, again, probably from going in and out of first the gallery in Dawson Street before the Taylor Gallery moved to Kildare Street. And I was always hugely attracted to that landscape work. And his particular vision, which I think probably comes from a certain kind of lineage in Irish landscape art, Jack Yates on to Paddy Collins and down to Sean, with lots of others, of course. But we had I was still working as a journalist in the Irish Times. We had a conversation in the Salsas on that occasion.
Which is in Navan, isn't it?
In Navan.
Yeah.
And the director, Belinda Quirk, became aware of my links to County Meath, and I think back then said we must do a project someday. And that day came maybe about 3 years ago when she and I met again. Again, another visual art project called Out of the Marvellous, which had originated with Kilkenny Design, and it was it was matching poets and artists. They were craft artists, and it after it opened in Kilkenny, it went to Navan, where I was kind of reunited with the idea of doing a project in County Meath.
Yeah.
So Belinda and I started talking about it, and this was in a gallery space, and I had always just simply written for the page in that quiet, off the radar screen way that writers work.
Yeah.
And I could not visualize what I would do in a relationship with a visual arts gallery. So the idea of a collaboration, and it was, the offer was very wide open, the brief was very wide open. She said, would you like to work with a composer, a photographer, an artist? And I said, I want to work with Sean McSweeney, if Sean is willing to work with me. Because the other thing I'd become aware of, being a fan of his work, is that his landscape, and knowing about the Meath background, was that his landscapes, for which he is noted, were landscapes of Wicklow. He lived in Wicklow for quite a number of years, but he's so closely associated with Sligo, which is from his mother's side of the family.
Which is where he lives now.
And he has, a bit like Jack Yates, there is that linkage as well with Sligo. He has been painting the landscape of County Sligo, where he is well settled. And I was baffled, knowing of his Meath connection, that he had never painted County Meath.
So he hadn't up to that point?
He hadn't up to that point ever, which he spoke to me about.
Yeah.
And those conversations were fascinating, because I was learning how an artist looks at a landscape, and he was telling me how different the landscapes were, and kind of questioning himself, can I tackle the Meath landscape? I had little doubt that he could.
So how did the process work? Did you start with conversations and then go off and individually create, or did he do something that you looked at, or did you do something that he looked at, or what was the actual process?
Before we knew that Sean was fully on board, I think I had started my part of it. Wasn't quite sure how long we were going to be given it. As it turned out, it was a 2-year project. I had this own notion in my own head of these Caminos walking the roads of County Meath, which had a certain appeal for me, but reconnecting and revisiting old haunts, I suppose. Sean and I started with a dialogue. We simply talked about memories. The overlap in geography was astonishing. He came, it's all centred around a village called Wilkins Town, which is on 7 miles north of Navan. It's on the road to Nobber. When I was a young fella, I used to have to get the Carrigan Cross bus, which stopped at the crossroads where my grandmother's house was. His house, where his side came from, was in Clongale, which again is, you know, to use the old cliche, a stone's throw from where my mother's house was, down towards Knightstown.
So it would be great, maybe, because it would be lovely to hear some poems as we go along to illustrate this. Is there a poem that maybe sort of captures some of that area?
Well, the village of Wilkins Town, I suppose, is the linkage between the two. You go in one direction and you hit my grandmother's house, and the house where my mother was born, and you turn a corner and down that road is where Sean's father came from. So this is called the Blackbirds of Wilkins Town, which Wilkins Town, as I always discovered long after my boyhood there, had linkages to Francis Ledwidge. I use an epigraph from a letter Ledwidge wrote to a woman who lived in the village called Lizzie Healy around 1915, 1916, just before he went off to the First World War. And he writes to her to say, and this is the epigraph to the Blackbirds of Wilkins Town: "It is spring now, and it must be lovely down in Wilkins Town. Are the birds singing yet? When you hear a blackbird, think of me." The Blackbirds of Wilkins Town. There's a village where nothing has changed for years. Sweet pastures, through which the railway track is a memento kept as part of the scenery. The bog, where bog work was a tug of war, where Ledwidge's blackbird flaunted her song. The gatekeeper's cottage is gone, no need now for the gatekeeper's morning and evening vigil. The trees are like trees in a Russian novel, tall and gaunt, some ready to fall in the next winter storm. The righteous have their inner sanctum, the country chapel where they pray for the bride at the altar, the soul in the box. No spectacle ever intrudes, except when the blackbirds arrive. Through the sweet pastures, meeting ground of the harriers, it's a short walk from schoolhouse to cemetery, where husbands and wives are resting in peace, and stone walls keep a little of the sun's day warmth for night that comes darkening the harvested fields.
Beautiful, beautiful. And again, people might be surprised that, you know, that there is a Ledwidge link, because we associate him with Slane.
Yes, the Ledwidge link is through this woman, Lizzie Healy, who was a sister of the local school teacher. She was, they came from Slane. Her brother Paddy was a friend of Ledwidge's, and they lived in what was possibly the school teacher's house, which was in the village. Lizzie's sister and brother-in-law were local school teachers, and she was living in that house with them, kind of looking after the house, I think, for some time around that period. And Ledwidge got to know her and used to cycle out from Slane to see her, and they'd actually take routes, and he describes this in several letters, on bicycles or walking down to the local bog, Fletcherstown bog, beyond. When I read these descriptions in some of the letters that Ledwidge wrote to Lizzie, what I found extraordinary, that 50 years later, which is the time I would have been taking notice of my surroundings and the environment there in the mid-60s, so little had changed. I thought the reference to the trees, and this is something that also fascinated Sean, because as an artist this was something that hugely interested. Many of the small watercolours and drawings and paintings that he did of the area, he was very focused on the trees. Independently as an artist, this for him was very interesting. But the linkage to Ledwidge was fascinating. I think if I discovered it when I started writing poems there, it would have been really interesting. But as we all know, in school in the 1960s, when we did Ledwidge, it was only for that one poem in memory of Thomas MacDonagh.
Yeah.
There was no, we weren't told much about his involvement in the British Army or the sacrifice that he made.
Yeah, we weren't
and the
ready.
complex nature of his character that had, you know, I mean, he had been a nationalist, and he had been involved in the Gaelic language movement, and then went off for good, conscientious reasons.
So you said a little earlier that you know, your first poems were written in Meath. So was part of this project for you a kind of a recovery of those first poetic impulses in a way, or?
I think it was. I mean, there are different layers to the project. Sean and I, we soon realised it was a project about memory. It was about retrieval for each of us. And coming back to your question about how the process, we did go off on separate ways for a good deal of it. I was writing and sending him poems, and very moved by his responses. In some of our conversations, very often just on the phone, that dialogue, there were prompts. I had forgotten completely about the Yellow River, even though when he said it, he said, you know, and do you remember the Yellow River? Something like that. The resonance was just, you know, went kind of through me, because in the farm cottage, you know, place names were coming up all the time, and I just remember the Yellow River being spoken about so much for some reason. And I think immediately or soon after, the Yellow River was the obvious title. It kind of connected both of us. But the processes where I was sending him poems, we eventually started doing trips together. We
like field trips.
Field trips. I was showing him my old haunts, and he was showing me his. We went to where my grandmother's house was, still is, because he then, when I had left County Meath, he was staying on for a week to do some sketching, and I learned that he had actually been sketching the house and looking at the house, and I was really moved by though. I mean, I think in the end, in the exhibition and in the book, there were 5 depictions of the house. And that is the house in which I did write my first poems, and the house in which my mother was born.
And is this the house mentioned in When the Elms Died?
It is, yeah.
Would it maybe be possible to hear that?
Yeah, and because we were talking so much about trees, and his knowledge of trees is far better than mine. But I did. There was outside, and the house itself is on what is now a main road. It didn't appear to be a main road back in the 1960s. The road on up north up to Monaghan and Cavan. I was telling him about the elms outside, kind of country lane to the side of the house, and how they fascinated me, because they created these dapples on the laneway, but there was an old farm kitchen table where we all gathered round for the meals just inside this little window, and it would reflect into the window as well. And back in the 1980s, during Dutch elm occurrence here throughout the country, I think at the time, I went down at that stage, I think probably with my own children. My aunt was still living in the house, and the tree was gone. And it kind of had its emotional moments for me. So Sean in his depictions restores the tree. He puts the tree back in, but the poem is about what the trees, I suppose, those 2 trees meant to me. When the elms died, and the one that shaded grandmother's house had to be cut down, all things changed. In the days that followed, when the tree was gone, I was more aware of it than when it was there, dripping rain, stenciling dapples across the country lane, sometimes even through the windows onto the kitchen table. It stood like a sentinel opposite house and yard, but above all else its disappearance took away a sound of nature, the push and shove of leaves and the high winds making love. When the elms died and the tree cutter left only a stump, the songbirds travelled on. A new loss was added to the melancholy roll call.
And I think his painting is also called When the Elm Died, and there aren't that many examples of cross-referencing of titles between the paintings and the poems in that way, but that clearly was a kind of a key image for both of you.
It was, and it was a key part of the conversation that was going on between us. I mean, I took him to that spot. We were looking at the house, and I said there was a field just across from the gate into the yard. That's where my elms were. But so a lot of things were being revived in imagination, I suppose.
And would you say that you began to write differently through your exposure to that collaboration, and would you say maybe that he was beginning to paint differently, or is it possible to see your influence on each other?
Well, I do think Sean was painting differently, and I suppose I know that by the reaction to the work. I mean, there are paintings that, but it's still, you have signature Sean McSweeney here. You have the McSweeney colours, which are just wonderful. And that opened my eyes to the colours of the county in some way, the colours of County Meath. Because Sean has a distinctive colour chart, a very distinctive colour chart. When the show opened in Navan, he spoke particularly about the yellow. There's a beautiful summer field yellow. I think I might have thought of Meath in darker colours myself. So the fact, first of all, he was painting a different landscape. And it took him a while to actually, as we were making these trips particularly, and he was doing sketches. And the sketches were wonderful, the drawings. He was adjusting, I think, the way he looks himself at the landscape. And I think that emerged in the work. I mean, I know people looked at them and said, they are Sean McSweeney, but there's so unlike. There's something unfamiliar and familiar here.
Is it harder to kind of say whether there was an unfamiliar Smyth in there?
I don't know, and I think others have to judge that. I mean, I mentioned having written about County Meath before, but I think I wrote differently with these. I was certainly looking into I mean, there are landscape poems there. There are personal family poems. There are some odd ones in terms of bringing them into a Meath context, I suppose. But I was also looking 50 years later, and I was looking through a different, I had, I think, a different perspective.
Do you want to choose one that might maybe illustrate that?
Well, I'll go back, I'll read the summer of 1968, when I wrote the first poems. Once I got into my adolescent years, I was going down to my grandmother, I think, really for a lot of harvest labouring, because it was haymaking time, it was bog cutting time, and I, you know, as an urbanite, as someone who was growing up listening, listening to cars out on the streets of Dublin 8, smelling Guinness's brewery on the Liffey, this was a wonderful extra, I say I was twice blessed, and I in the introduction, and I do mean that. I would think I was starting to bring books with me. I remember, for example, reading John McGahern's The Barracks the first time in that country kitchen. In the summer of 1968, a friend gave me a book of E. Cummings. My interest in poetry was beginning to get quite serious, and I remember getting a copy of the Liverpool poet, the Mersey poets that summer as well, and having that with me. And I do think I had written some poems the previous summer, and through that, which were in an old school copybook that I no longer have. But that summer of '68, I think it got serious, because the poems I wrote that summer, I sent to David Marcus. I was still in secondary school, and I sent them to Marcus in the autumn, and we had a short correspondence. He wanted to see other poems, and my first poems were published in January 1969 in New Irish Writing.
It's amazing how many people have sat in that seat and talked about the influence of David Marcus in terms of giving them that first outlet. I'll never,
and I still have the letters he wrote to me in response to those poems written in Meath in 1968. They're not poems I'd be waving around now at this stage.
But still, that process begins.
I remember one of them was called Town, and it was about Navan, which was a different place to what it is now. And I think I was trying to be some kind of pastoralist as well. The book that the Mersey poets, I think it was Brian Patton, was the one I really took to.
I think our cameraman director is a big fan of Brian Patton as well.
Well, I've kept the faith with Brian Patton. I might have left the other two, McGough and
that's not poor Roger. Hi Roger. He watches this. I'm sure he does.
But Patton's lyric voice really appealed to me, and I think was probably an early influence. I think I may have borrowed a copy of Dylan Thomas as well, so I had those books with me. But this poem, is an attempt, I suppose, to look back on that particular summer and how the poetry kind of crept into my life. The year I turned to poetry. The year I turned to poetry, 16 years of dreaming were all I had, when my first muse put the scribe's pen in my hand. Now my life is 4 times that, and I am back where it all began, looking for the midden that expanded like the universe in a corner of the yard, under daytime's silver birches, nighttime's bottleneck of stars. It was here my forefathers laboured for years, grinding hard clods into fine clay. Their house of sanctuary still stands, but rooms have been added, and I cannot find the window where they scanned the Milky Way. It was here I first looked for words to describe the sacred and absurd. I looked in the furrows, the stubble, beneath pine needles lying where they fell, under leaves that dropped from branches of the elm. That elm tree again.
Now, very technical question. How did you decide the order of the poems and the pictures for the book? Who made those decisions?
We all sat down. Sean, Belinda, myself. This was before the wonderful designer Una Young was involved, and then we brought Una in on it because her designer's eye, exquisite, brought something extra to that. Some were obvious. There were poems. I think one of the early poems was Knightstown, which is about. It's about the house, which Sean had painted several times. So the painting Knightstown and the poem Knightstown were an obvious match
pairing,
in the sequencing. The first poem in it, Today Is Not Enough, it was written in 1969, and was the first poem, certainly in the first small book I did with New Writers Press, and I've subsequently kept that poem in several collections.
Would you read it?
Today Is Not Enough. And I've dated it, Wilkins Town, August 1969. I've rarely done that with a poem. Today is not enough. Today is not enough to remember forever this summer, strolling late across emptied meadows and the tumble-down yard. How eerie the motionless grass and the single bush of blackberries, the cowshed smelling of its dung heap on this voiceless afternoon. It's probably the only poem, it is the only poem in the Yellow River that was written on the site. I wrote it, sometimes some things you don't forget. I would spend months, maybe years writing a poem now. I wrote it sitting in the yard before I left in August 1969, because I knew it was probably the last summer that I would be there.
So you were deliberately capturing.
So I was trying to freeze frame, I think I say in the introduction, that particular moment. Oddly enough, I wrote it in a kind of plain style that I then left to go experimenting with all sorts of other things, and then arrive back where I started in terms of stylistically.
And I mean, it's a beautiful thing. It's an absolutely gorgeous book. It's still an exhibition, because you were saying that it's going to be in the Triskel in Cork later this year.
The exhibition, which looked wonderful in its home setting in Navan, will be going to Cork, to the Triskel, and perhaps other places.
Because it would be great to get it over to the model, for example, where Sean is. And
it would, and to get it. I mean, I know it's about a very specific geographical location, but the responses, including places like Montreal, someone wrote to me from Canada. I suppose.
Well, it is universal, because it is about everybody has a home place, or a place that has nurtured creativity.
Yeah.
Or that sort of sense of family connections. So it might be Meath, it might be your Meath, but that will resonate with everybody.
Yeah, and I mean, despite my Dublin side, I suppose, poet Thomas Kinsella once said to me, he said, "I'd like to remind you that neither of us is a real Dubliner,
Blow-ins.
But our children are. I think generationally, when you go down, if they're born in the city, but I mean it again. It was probably some kind of counterbalance to that urban side in me, and again, I'm very deeply grateful that I had it through my mother, because it has I mean, I couldn't have written any of these poems. They wouldn't exist, or they would have been in some phony form, I think, if I hadn't had that kind of Heaney-esque experience on bog and on field,
And has it given you a taste for collaboration? Again, I was thinking, if you had a choice of any artist, dead or alive, that you might do another collaboration with.
Any artist, dead or alive, Irish or international?
Oh, your choice.
Oh gosh.
Because we're in the realm of make-believe here. Or maybe not.
Well, he's very similar to I mean, he's, I suppose Jack Yeats is similar to, but he had his own poet, of course, and might have been that he mightn't have wanted to work with. I mean, the thing about Sean, the other thing about Sean is his works are very poetical, and literary people. I mean, his relationship with Dermot Healy was very, very close. His work is on the cover of so many of Dermot's books, and belongs there. There are certain artists who are, poets, painters, and vice versa, and I think I think that. I know Helen Vendler is a big fan of his work. I think that you probably wouldn't find that in all artists. You'd have to find a certain sympathy between the work of each one for it to work well. I didn't quite answer your question.
No.
It's such a big question.
Yeah. No, but I think you did, and I think that's a sense of the connection between the two parts of the collaboration is important. It's not just arbitrary. There are reasons why it works.
Martin Gale is another very poetic painter whose work I admire. But I feel if you've done it once, you leave it. You leave it. Maybe a photographer might be different, of working with a photographer at some point. But
very good. Or a cameraman.
Or a cameraman, indeed.
thank you so much for coming to talk to us about the Yellow River. It is a
Pleasure.
beautiful book. It is a limited edition, limited enough in that there weren't that many printed. So I would advise you, if you can get your hands on a copy, do. It is a beautiful thing, and it will stand the test of time. So Gerard Smyth, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, Nessa. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for watching. We'll be back again next month with more interesting discussion about the world of writing.
Yes, I know that I'm just a dreamer. I dream 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.